drafted resolution in the United Nations. This is one of the core training processes that UNITAR does through the year. It's very important because drafting resolutions is the most, what I can say, important part of a diplomat life in New York. Is a policy-making document, is a legislative process for staff in the Secretariat, and is the highest recommendations at the General Assembly, the main committees or specialized bodies like the ECOSOC or the Security Council give to member states. Resolutions vary according to the scenario in which they are adopted. I mean by that ECOSOC, General Assembly, or the draft resolutions in the main committees or in the Security Council. So this is one of the most important elements for a diplomat in New York. So I am very pleased that we managed to put it together a very good experience and knowledgeable panelists for you from the Secretariat that basically will conducted these conversations with you. You are diplomats. Many of you already maybe has been supporting or following a draft resolution process. Maybe you already drafted or introduced a resolution in the main committees or contributed to one of them through a paragraph or other forms in the discussions informally that you have. You know there are several steps that take place in adopting a resolution in the United Nations. So I am very pleased that we managed during these pandemic times to put it together once again, this training course. Fortunately, we have to do it like we did last year due to COVID-19 and the restrictions that we are having to make a safe environment for the staff and for you also in the United Nations Secretariat. Normally, we do these trainings in the conference room in the Secretariat, but the United Nations is still under restricted access just in order to have a safe environment for everybody. So in a couple of weeks, the high-level political forum of the Economic and Social Council will start, and some tests will be made on participation and going back to the premises. The Secretariat also, Secretary General has been re-elected recently, last week, and then he also sent a motivating letter to a staff of the Secretariat to have an orderly return to functions in the Secretariat. So hopefully by September and for the next trimester next year, we will have a better environment to meet once again in the conference room in the United Nations Secretariat here in New York. By the time being, thanks to the technology, we are able to put it together, these trainings via BTC. There is not much change basically in the substantive part of the trainings. We will have all the documents posted. You will have the PowerPoint presentations. The sessions are recorded for you to review it later on, to listen or to take note more carefully about the panelist presentation or the PowerPoints they're going to do with us. So we are very, as I said, as UNITAR, very, very pleased that we managed to put this training together. So the other administrative thing that I wanted to share with you is that we intend to have, in order to give you more space and break, 2 sessions, one this morning and one tomorrow morning. Unfortunately, 2 of the panelists for tomorrow are very busy in the preparation of their daily work in the United Nations Secretariat. So we're going to have a full day today. We're going to have a session in the morning and another session in the afternoon. So please stay tuned. We're going to have a break for lunch, and then you're going to continue in the afternoon with the second part or the second session that was programmed for tomorrow. So you're going to discuss things like agenda of the General Assembly, preparing a draft resolution, some information about the program planning at budget division. You know, some resolutions have financial implications in the United Nations. And so it's important that you understand what is the difference between the resolution that doesn't have financial implications and those who have financial implications. Then we will have also something related to legal affairs, the rule of procedures related to resolutions, the voting process. Resolutions are adopted by vote or by consensus. You will understand what is the differences among them. And then you will have how to negotiate or how to prepare the resolution among your colleagues. What are the process of producing a resolution per se? And so this is the most important elements of a draft resolution. So you will discuss that. Then you will also see what is the most terminology that is used, preambular part, operative part, the elements that constitute a document called resolution in the United Nations. So we also prepare, and you are invited to look on this, what is called a United Nations guidelines for draft resolutions in the United States. It's self-explanatory. It does not substitute the conversation that you will have with our distinguished panelists today, but it will help you if you want to have a more long document to review at every time that you're going to face the possibility to draft it or negotiate it or present or introduce a draft resolution. Finally, please engage with the panelists. We do not lecture anyone. You are highly educated professionals representing your country, and we're just trying to facilitate your work. This is the mandate of UNITAR. We're just trying to facilitate your work. And on the other hand, we're trying to put you in contact with the people in the Secretariat, that they are there just to support you every single step on your tour of duty in New York. They are your friends. So consider them like your friends, and in one hand, and in the other, like the, when you are in the middle of the ocean of a lot of problems or a lot of activities that you have to do, they are there to give you a helping hand. So engage with them, talk to them, put your queries. They are not dumb questions in the United Nations, so everything is important. So that will be also important for them to know where to strengthen their trainings or their documentations or the queries that you have will help them to navigate the language or the documents that they needed to have. We have this morning Radhika, or Shalik, I hope I pronounce your name, Radhika, in an appropriate manner. She is the Senior Intergovernmental Affairs Officer of the General Assembly Affairs for the Department of General Assembly Conference Management. So she will give us an understanding of the scope of resolutions. Then we will have other colleagues like Anglorm Michelet, Shalom, and then we will have Juan Eslin, Mario Zambrano, which is one of your colleagues from the Equatorian Mission. We will have Tomoko Iwata from the Legal Affairs Officers, and Fernando Marani from the Office of the President of the General Assembly. So at due time, when they come to present their case to you, they will be properly introduced. I just want to keep this in an informal manner. I don't want it to waste much of your time. We have a little icebreaker video that I will ask them to put it together. It's less than a minute, Radhika, so if you allow us, we will move to that, and also it will help you to see what we do in terms of capacity building and training for our diplomats in New York. And it's a funny experience too. Guys, can you run the short video, please?
How does an idea become a UN resolution? First, let's be clear about what we are talking about. What is a UN resolution? It's the formal expression of the opinion or will of a United Nations organ. What is the procedure for drafting and adopting one? Meet Sophie. Sophie is a UN delegate, and she wants to draft a resolution on behalf of her member state. She starts by selecting a topic and checks if it relates to an agenda item of the General Assembly. If not, she writes to the Secretary General to submit it. Sophie can now start the drafting process. To ensure support for her resolution, she seeks assistance from other member states' delegations. She also holds informal consultations to gather ideas. Sophie can now write her resolution, which is officially submitted by Sophie's member state to the General Assembly. Does the draft resolution require funds? If the answer is yes, the resolution will make a detour to the Budget Division, who creates a PBI report and sends it to the Advisory Committee and then to the 5th Committee. They review and return it to the General Assembly. If the answer is no, it can directly move on to the next step. Before submitting the resolution for consideration, Sophie seeks out co-sponsors. Well done, Sophie! The draft resolution is scheduled for consideration and published in the UN Journal. Now it's time to introduce it to the General Assembly. Amendments can be proposed now, right before the debate on questions. Once the debate is closed, the Assembly proceeds to the voting process. If Sophie's resolution is considered an important issue according to the General Assembly, Rule 85, she needs 2/3 of those present and voting to agree. If not, a simple majority is enough. Congratulations, Sophie! Your resolution has just been adopted.
Thank you very much for this short video. Just to illustrate to you how this process goes. I hope you enjoy it. And so you can also, as I said, get these guidelines very easily. Just check on the UNITAR website and you can have it. So now we're going to move to the first session. As I said, we have the honor and pleasure to introduce Radhika, Senior Intergovernmental Affairs Officer for the General Assembly. She will talk to you about how it is prepared, this famous document, the resolution, who can propose new items on the agenda of the General Assembly, what are the deadlines for proposing new items in the agenda, and when and how is the agenda and when is the agenda constituted. Those are the first elements when you are going to discuss a draft resolution or going to seek the possibility of preparing a draft resolution. Later on, we will discuss with Anne-Laure Michelet, resolution and decisions in the Economic and Social Council and the Security Council, the part of a resolution, preambular, operative part, drafting and editing, and we will go on in this process. So I'm going to stop here. I welcome Radhika. Thank you very much for your time. You are very kind to be with us. I'm going to leave you now, and I'm going to leave you the following part of this training session with my colleagues, Pelayo Alvarez and Ali Otis, who will keep you company for the rest of today. Enjoy, participate, and let us know in which way we can improve these sessions. Radhika, I yield to you, and once again, thank you from my part for being with us today.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone, and good evening to the other side of the world if you're joining from other parts. I will just wait for the PowerPoint presentation to come online. But as was said, my name is Radhika Ohalik. I'm a Senior Intergovernmental Affairs Officer in the General Assembly Affairs branch. And our department is Department for General Assembly and Conference Management. So we support the meetings of the GA, some of the subsidiary bodies of the GA, and ECOSOC and some of its subsidiary bodies. This session, as I said, as was said before, will focus on the agenda. So agenda of the GA, what documents comprise the agenda documents, how they are prepared, how are items proposed for inclusion in the agenda, and a little bit on the work of the General Committee. And then we will have some time for the questions at the end. Let's move to the next slide. Sorry, I'm just going to wait for the next slide. Okay, great. So this is basically a listing of the various agenda documents. So the first document is the preliminary list of items to be included in the provisional agenda. Then the next agenda document is the annotated preliminary list of items. Then we have the provisional agenda, followed by supplementary list of items. Then comes the annotated draft agenda. And next slide, please. After the annotated draft agenda, we have the memorandum by the Secretary General on the organization of work, adoption of the agenda and allocation of items. Thereafter, we have the report of the General Committee, and then the final agenda, and finally the allocation of items. So now I will go one by one and explain a little bit more about each document. So we tend to the preliminary list of items. So the preliminary list, I wonder if it can be like in a slideshow. Is it in a slideshow? So that the picture is a little bit bigger, I'm not sure.
Yes, we'll enlarge.
Slideshow, yeah, okay. So the preliminary list is issued in accordance with GA Resolution 2837 of the 26th session, in which the GA recommended that the SG communicate to member states no later than 15 February the unofficial list of items proposed for inclusion in the provisional agenda. So basically, by 15 February, the Secretariat is supposed to come up with a preliminary list of items to be included in the provisional agenda for the upcoming session. So this year in February, we issued the document, the preliminary list of items for the upcoming 76th session. The document symbol of the preliminary list is A/session number /50. So each year, the preliminary list for each session is issued as A session number 50. So A75, 50, A76, 50. The preliminary list of items includes all the items that have been mandated to be included in the agenda through, so we can go to the slide, which is the preliminary list of items. Not the next one, but so the list of items in the preliminary list, they are included based on the rules of procedure. So there are items reflected in the preliminary list that are mandated through the rules of procedure. Example, opening of the session by the president of the GA. It's been included or reflected in the preliminary list because of rules of procedures 1, 30, and 31. The preliminary list also includes items that have resolutions and decisions from previous sessions whereby there was a mandate requested for it to be implemented at the upcoming session. Hence, the item needs to be in the preliminary list. And these mandates typically include a request to the SG to prepare a report, or a request for the PGA, or a request for the GA, General Assembly, to hold a meeting, or sometimes the resolution has a specific request that the item entitled so and so be included in the agenda in the provisional agenda. So these are typical mandates that when we prepare the preliminary list, we in the Secretariat read through the resolutions and see if there's a report requested. That means that item needs to be in the agenda. If there needs to be a meeting held, then the item under which the meeting needs to be held is required in the agenda. The preliminary list also includes items such as the report of the Security Council, report of the Economic and Social Council, report of the International Court of Justice, and reports of subsidiary bodies such as the report of the Human Rights Council. The preliminary list also includes report of the SG on the organization of work, items pertaining to the budget, and then there are a group of items that remain on the agenda for consideration upon notification by a member state. At the 78th session, there was a revitalization exercise done looking at the agenda of the GA to see how it can be streamlined. And at that stage, member states had identified 5 or 6 items that they thought it would be good to just keep them in the item, and depending on a request or a notification from a member state, that item could be taken up or considered by the GA. So they always remain in the agenda. For each item in the preliminary list, we also provide the resolution or decision that mandates the item to be included in the agenda. So if you can look in the screen, there are items, for instance, report of the Peace Building Commission, and then there is a resolution reference provided. So it shows that because of that resolution, the item is in the agenda. The preliminary list also includes the dates of issuance of other agenda-related documents. And, on the cover page, it will indicate, when the annotated preliminary list is supposed to be issued, the provisional agenda, supplementary list, and the memorandum of SG on the work of the organization. Plus, it indicates the start date of the upcoming session. We will move to the next slide, which deals with the provisional agenda. So after the preliminary list comes out in February, we will then in the Secretariat start working towards the provisional agenda. So the provisional agenda is issued in accordance with Rule 12 of the Rules of Procedure of the GA, in which it's requested or indicated that the provisional agenda for the regular session shall be drawn by the SG and communicated to member states at least 60 days before the opening of the session. So the provisional agenda builds upon the preliminary list, and it includes items that are in the preliminary list, plus any additional items that have been requested by member states for inclusion in the provisional agenda. It also includes any additional resolutions or decisions that have been adopted by the GA that mandate an item to be included in the upcoming session's agenda. Member states can propose an item for inclusion in the provisional agenda in accordance with Rule 13 to be included in the provisional agenda, which gets issued by mid-July, which is at least 60 days before the opening of the session. If a member state wishes to request for the inclusion of an item in the provisional agenda, then the request needs to be submitted to the Secretariat before mid-July. The request comes to the Secretariat, it gets issued as a document, and then it's reflected in the provisional agenda, which comes out in mid-July. The 76th session, for the upcoming 76th session, the provisional agenda is to be issued by 16 July. So if a member state wanted to request an item to be included in the provisional agenda of the 76th session, then their request for the inclusion of the new item needs to reach the GA Affairs branch before 16 July. In accordance with Rule 20 of the Rules of Procedure of the GA, the proposal for inclusion should be accompanied by an explanatory memorandum, so sort of explaining why the item should be included in the agenda of the General Assembly, and if possible, a sample draft resolution to be attached to the request. So to give an idea of what the draft resolution would look like that would be adopted once the item is included in the agenda. Also, in accordance with GA Resolution 2837 of the 26th session, it is recommended that member states, when they request the inclusion of an item in the provisional agenda, to indicate where they want the item to be considered, whether they want it to be considered in one of the main committees, the first, the fourth committee, or the second, third, fifth, or sixth, or they want it to be considered directly in the GA plenary. So the request for the inclusion of an item in the provisional agenda needs to come to the Secretariat before middle of July. The request needs to indicate, it needs to be accompanied by an explanatory memorandum, indicating also where the item could be considered, and if possible, attach a sample draft resolution to be adopted. Some of the, if your delegation was thinking of requesting an inclusion of an item, you may wish to refer to some sample documents, for instance, A75142, which was a letter from the permanent representative of Belize addressed to the Secretary General requesting for the inclusion of an item entitled Observer Status for Small Island Developing States DOC. There is example A73141, which was a letter from a group of countries addressed to the SG requesting the inclusion of an item entitled Strengthening and Promoting the International Treaty Framework. And then the request was also accompanied saying that it be allocated to the sixth committee. The request that comes in needs to be addressed to the Secretary General, and it could be by one member state or a group of member states. When you're looking for samples for requests from past sessions, it's always something good to keep in mind that past request for inclusion in the provisional agenda, it's been issued as a session number document 141. So the first request that we receive in the Secretariat, we issue it as a session number. So for 76 session, it would be A76141. The next request that we receive for inclusion in the provisional agenda, it would be a session number 142, and then the third one would be 143, and it follows. So that's basically the provisional agenda. We will now move to the supplementary list of items. The supplementary list of items is issued in accordance with Rule 14 of the Rules of Procedure of the GA, which states that any member state or a principal organ of the UN or the Secretary General may, at least 30 days before the date fixed for the opening of a regular session, request the inclusion of supplementary items. Such items shall be placed on a supplementary list, which will be communicated to member states at least 20 days before the opening of the session. So after the provisional agenda has come out and your delegation wants to submit a request for a new item, then that request gets reflected in the supplementary list because the provisional agenda is already issued by that time. Now, based on the rules of procedure, if you are requesting for a new item after the provisional agenda has been issued, then you have to do it in accordance with Rule 14, which pertains to the supplementary list. And the request needs to be submitted to the Secretariat at least 30 days before the opening of the session. And then we compile all of the requests that we have received, and we issue the supplementary list 20 days before the session opens. So for the 76th session, the requests need to be submitted to the Secretariat. Let me just see, should be submitted to us 30 days in advance. So that would be by 13 August. So if your delegation was thinking of submitting a request for inclusion of a new item after the provisional agenda has been issued, then that request needs to be submitted to us by 13 August. And then we will issue the supplementary list by 25th of August for the 76th session. When you submit the request for the supplementary list, an item to be included in the supplementary list, it's basically the same requirements as those that need to be that pertain to the request for an item in the provisional agenda, namely that the request will need to be accompanied by an explanatory memorandum explaining why you want this item to be included in the agenda. If possible, a draft resolution to be attached to the request, and also where you prefer the item to be considered. The only difference between the two requests, whether it's for the provisional agenda or for the supplementary list, is reference to the rules of procedure. Supplementary list of items are always issued with the same symbol, that is the symbol 200. So for the 75th session, the supplementary list of item was issued as A75-200. For the upcoming session, the 76th session, if we receive any request for items to be included in the supplementary list, then it will be in document A76-200. Another, fact to keep in mind is that if you're looking for samples of how requests were done for supplementary list of items, then all the requests that we received, they are issued with symbol A, session number starting 191. So if you see in the document, the first request that we received, we issued it as A75-191, and then the next one was issued as A75-192, and then 193, and it follows until we have received whatever requests they are. Sometimes we might not receive any requests for new items in the supplementary list, so then we don't have document A, the 200 document issued. Sometimes there might be only one request, which is then reflected in the 200 series document. Next slide, please. Now turning to the annotated preliminary list of items. So I was saying at the start that in February, we issue a preliminary list of items. So then after the preliminary list of item is issued in February, the Secretariat drafts and puts together something called the annotated agenda. It's informally called an annotated agenda, and it's issued in accordance with GA Resolution 2837, and it's supposed to be issued no later than 15 June. So it's in between the issuance of the preliminary list and the provisional agenda. We come up with a annotated preliminary list. So this document is always issued as 100. So A, session number 100. The 76th session annotated agenda has already been issued, and it's available on the official documentation system as A76-100. The document, what it basically does, it takes each item that is in the preliminary list, and it provides a little bit of information on that item. So each item will have a brief history on the item. For example, how the item was included in the agenda, all the resolutions and decisions that have been adopted under that item since it was included in the agenda, any major mandate that have been adopted under that item, as well as what is expected under that item for the upcoming session, and what are the documents that are expected under the item for the upcoming session. The annotations for the annotated agenda, the 100 series, is basically the items that are in the preliminary list, and we annotate them. Now, when we put the annotated agenda, the 100 document, for issuance in June, it could very well be that there are some items in the current session that are not considered by the General Assembly. The GA has not taken any decision on an item in the current session. So we in the Secretariat don't know yet what is expected under the item for the upcoming session, for the 76th session. So when we prepare the 100 document, there might be some items, even though they are in the preliminary list, we say that let's not annotate it right now because there's not much we can provide. Let's wait a little bit later and see what the GA does. And then we will annotate it, we will update the annotation and issue it later in an addendum. So if you look at the table of content of the document from the 75th session, when we submitted this document, the A75-100 for issuance, at that time, we didn't, the GA didn't consider the item on the election of the president of the GA. So we didn't annotate that for A75-100. The annotation was done as an addendum, as an additional document. If you go to the next slide, please, thank you. So this is how the text under each item would sort of look like. So I'm giving you the example from an item that is considered by the GA called Culture of Peace. So the annotation shows that the item was included in the agenda of the GA at the 52nd session at a request of a number of states. Now, if you want to know who were the states that requested for the inclusion of the item, you would go to document A52191. So A52191 was inclusion of an item in the supplementary list. And then if you click on that document, you will see that it had an explanatory memorandum, a sample draft resolution, and indication of where the item should be allocated to. Then the annotation indicates that the item Culture of Peace has been in the agenda since the 55th session. And then it lists all the resolutions that have been adopted under the item. And you can click on any of that resolution if you wanted to get a little bit of background on what that resolution was about. And then the annotation includes some of the key resolutions that were adopted under the item. Examples, resolution 64/13, whereby the GA designated 18 July as Nelson Mandela International Day. Then we also have what actions were taken under the item at the 75th session. Basically, that there was a resolution adopted and the SG is requested to submit a report under the item at the 76th session. So we have to, since we're preparing the annotated agenda for the 76th session, we have to indicate what is expected under the item at the 76th session. So we say that based on the resolution, the SG is supposed to submit a report. So as you can see, there are 3 resolutions with mandates for the 76th session. So we indicated what those mandates are. And then we provide documentation that's expected. We're saying that under this item for the 76th session, there are 2 SG reports expected. And then we provide a little bit of reference from the 75th session. What happened under the item at the 76th session? What were the reports of the SG? How many draft resolutions were before the GA? What resolutions were adopted during the 75th session, and what plenary meetings when the item was considered. So something like this, the annotated agenda, the 100 series document will have for each item. So it's a very, very useful reference document if you are following up, the item Culture of Peace, you are assigned to it, and you want to know a little bit of what happened under this item and what is expected at the upcoming session. That would be your starting point to sort of see. And if you're covering a committee, all the items that are assigned to a committee are also annotated. So you would have similar information for each item. Next slide, please. Now, as I was saying, that when we prepare the annotated agenda, the 100, there might be some items that are not taken up by the GA at that time. So we don't annotate them at that point. So we wait until we get to the end of the session so that we can capture any additional consideration of an item or anything that was not considered until that time, but later on considered. So we put all of that together in an addendum to the annotated agenda, and it gets issued as A/session number 100 Ed 1. And the addendum is issued in September, again, in accordance with GA Resolution 2837, whereby we capture everything that happened from June till September. So once the session ends, so the current session that's going on, the 75th session, when it ends in September, we finalize the Ed 1 and capture any new mandates. So if under the item Culture of Peace, there were any new resolutions adopted that have an impact or a mandate for the 76th session, then we update the annotation for that item. Or as I was saying, there might be some item that was not considered by the GA when we submitted the 100, and then come September, that item was considered. So we do the annotation and it gets all included in the Ed 1. So if you can see the document here, when we submitted it for processing the 100, the report of the Security Council item was not considered. So we indicated that it will be annotated in the Ed 1. Let's move to the next slide. So far we have sort of looked at the preliminary list of items. We have looked at the provisional agenda. We have looked at the supplementary list of items, and we have looked at the annotated agenda. So then we move to something called the Memorandum of the Secretary General on the organization of work, adoption of the agenda, and allocation of items. It's called a Burr paper. The symbol is A/BUR/session number 1. So the reason it has the BUR symbol and we call it a bureau paper is because it's for the consideration of the General Committee, which is the Bureau of the General Assembly. So, you know, if you're dealing with a, for example, Commission on Status of Women, it has a bureau that helps prepare for the commission. So for the GA, the bureau is the General Committee. And similar to other agenda documents, the symbol remains the same from one session to the other session, but just the session number changes. The bureau paper that's considered by the General Committee has 4 parts. It has an introductory part, then it has a big section on the organization of work with a lot of recommendations that the General Committee considers. And then it has the 3rd section on the adoption of the agenda and the 4th one on the allocation of items. So the session begins on the Tuesday of the 3rd week in September. The new session starts on Tuesday of the 3rd week in September. And then the General Committee meets the very next day to review this document, the bureau paper, the memorandum of the SG. The General Committee, in accordance with Rule 38 of the Rules of Procedure, consists or comprises of the PGA, who presides over the meetings of the General Committee, the 21 vice presidents that are elected by the GA, and the chairs of the 6 main committees of the GA. The main function, one of the main functions of the General Committee, in accordance with Rule 40 of the Rules of Procedure, is that at the beginning of each session, the General Committee is to consider the provisional agenda, the supplementary list of items, as well as request for any additional items, and make recommendations to the GA on those items. The General Committee also recommends on the allocation of items. So in September, the General Committee comes on the 2nd day of the session. It has this memorandum of the SG before it. And then it goes section by section. So it goes to the organization of work, which includes a number of issues that the SG is recommending for the for the General Committee's consideration and for the General Committee to then recommend to the GA. So issues such as the conduct of the meeting, the documentation, questions regarding program budget implications, opening dates of the session, closing date of the session. So it's a whole range of issues that the SG proposes. The General Committee looks at them, and most of the time the General Committee recommends them without much discussion to the GA for approval. And then the General Committee looks at the third section, which is the adoption of the agenda. So when in the Secretariat we prepare the memorandum of the SG, for the agenda part, we take all the items that were in the preliminary list and then the provisional agenda. So we take all the items that's in the provisional agenda, the A session number 150, and then any other items that were in the supplementary list, plus any additional items that might have been requested for inclusion. And we put them in the bureau paper, in the memorandum by the SG, which is then before the General Committee. And the General Committee goes item by item and takes a decision, a recommendation on those items, whether they should be included or whether they are not recommended for inclusion. And then it also goes into the allocation of items, you know, where it should go, whether it should be in the plenary or it should go to one of the main committees, or an item is better handled between two committees. So the General Committee makes recommendations with that also. When the General Committee is meeting, and in accordance with Rule 43, if a member state has requested for inclusion of an item and the member state is not a member of the General Committee, then that member state can be in the room and can participate on the discussion on the inclusion of that item. However, if a member state is not a member of the General Committee and wants to participate in the discussion on the inclusion of any item, and they're not the sponsor of that item, but they want to participate in the discussion, they have to request a permission from the General Committee. So upon a decision of the General Committee, that member state is given a seat at the committee's table, and then they can speak. So if I have requested as country X a new item to be included, and I'm not a member of the General Committee, I would ask that I'm be given the floor when my item is considered, and I would make a statement, explain why I think this item should be included. Now, if there's country Y who has not requested, is not part of my request for inclusion of the item, is not a member of the General Committee, then that country Y needs to seek permission from the General Committee to speak, you know, either in support of my request or against my request. So the General Committee then goes item by item, as I said, and makes recommendations on the inclusion of the item. So General Committee could decide that an item is recommended for inclusion in the agenda. The General Committee could say, we recommend that an item is not included in the agenda of the GA. The General Committee could recommend that consideration of an item is deferred to a future session of the GA, and that the item be included in the provisional agenda of that future session. And this usually happens for the item question of the Malagasy Islands of Gorieses, Juan de Nova, Europa, and Bases de India. The General Committee could also recommend the inclusion of an item on the understanding that there would be no discussion or consideration of the item by the General Assembly in that session. And this usually happens for the item on question of the Comorian island of Mayotte. The General Committee could also say that we are deciding to postpone to a later date, but within the same session, the consideration of the question of inclusion of an item. This happened at the 65th session, for example, when the General Committee decided that they will postpone the consideration of the inclusion of the item entitled Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And then the General Committee could come back at a later date, discuss the question of inclusion of the item, and then make a recommendation to the GA. In terms of the allocation, again, the General Committee goes item by item, but first looking at new items that are requested for inclusion, and they decide whether, where it should be allocated to, whether to a main committee or to the GA plenary. And then the General Committee goes and sort of takes a bulk decision for each main committee, saying that these items listed in the memorandum by the SG are going to the first committee. These items are going to be considered by the second committee, and so on. In terms of decision making, most of the decisions in the General Committee are taken without a vote, but there have been cases when a decision on the recommendation to include an item or on the allocation of an item has been taken through a vote. The committee in the past used to vote through show of hands, which is referred to as a non-recorded vote. So a non-recorded vote implies that when only the final tally is reflected in the summary records and in the report of the General Committee. So it will show what was the number of yes, what was the number of no votes, and how many members of the General Committee abstained. It will not show which member of General Committee voted how. Voting through show of hands in the recent years have been replaced with electronic voting, but similar to show of hands, a non-recorded vote, even through electronic means, only reflects the final tally in the summary records and in the report of the General Committee. However, if a member of the General Committee says that I am requesting for a vote on the issue of the inclusion of this item, and I'm requesting a recorded vote, then the summary record of the meeting of the General Committee and the report of the General Committee will show which member voted how. So there's a difference between recorded and non-recorded vote in the General Committee. Some examples when votes were taken in the General Committee in the 73rd session, when the General Committee was discussing the request for the inclusion of the item entitled The Situation in the Temporarily Occupied Territories of Ukraine. There was a vote requested by Ukraine, a recorded vote, and the committee had decided by 15 votes to 2 against and 9 abstentions that the item be recommended for inclusion in the agenda of the GA. At the 73rd session, there was also another recorded vote requested by Ukraine on the inclusion of the item on responsibility to protect, and the General Committee voted with 17 votes in favor, with 4 against and 5 abstentions, and recommended that the item be included in the agenda. In the 60th session, we had a case where there was a non-recorded vote requested on the issue of the allocation of the item report of the International Criminal Court. And with a non-recorded vote with 11 votes in favor, 3 against and 4 abstentions, the General Committee recommended that the item be allocated to the plenary and not to the 6th committee. There was also another example in the 49th session when again a non-recorded vote was taken on the allocation of the item capital punishment, whereby the General Committee decided with 14 votes in favor, with 0 against and 3 abstentions, that the item be allocated to the 3rd committee. Some additional points to keep in mind is that in accordance with Rule 15, the General Committee has considered requests for additional items as well. So at the beginning of the session, the General Committee looks at the memorandum of the SG and makes recommendations on the agenda. However, there have been cases when additional items have been submitted for inclusion in the agenda. These, generally speaking, are more sort of administrative, like financing of a new peacekeeping mission that might have been established, or appointment of someone that might have resigned and now there's a need for an item to be in the agenda. So those are additional items that can be considered by the General Committee. And a perfect example is during the current session, the 75th session, we had an additional item that was submitted by some delegations for request of an additional item on the appointment of the Secretary General of the United Nations. So the General Committee met on 4 June, held its second meeting, and recommended that the item appointment of the SG of the UN be included in the agenda of the current session as an additional item, and it be considered directly in the plenary meeting. Also, in accordance with Rule 15 of the Rules of Procedure, no additional item may be considered until 7 days have lapsed since it's placed in the agenda. So once an additional item is included, the General Committee meets, it makes its recommendation, General Committee recommendation goes to the GA, it's approved, the agenda is included, then the GA needs to wait for 7 days before the item can be considered. However, there have been cases when the GA has decided to waive Rule 15 or the relevant provision of Rule 15. This happened at the 75th session, at the 68th plenary meeting, when the GA decided to waive the Rule 15 provisions and went ahead and considered the item right away, which was about the election of the Executive Director of United Nations Environment Programme. Another issue to keep in mind in terms of the General Committee, as I was saying, the General Committee's main function is to make recommendations on inclusion of an item and allocation. However, there have been also cases where the GA decided to waive Rule 40. So the GA decided not to go to the General Committee, but to make the decision on the inclusion and allocation of an item by itself, so bypassing the General Committee. Again, these are not necessarily, these are more sort of on items that are administrative in nature or items that require immediate attention. So the General Assembly sort of waives the rule and then goes ahead and takes a decision on the inclusion of the item and where it should be allocated. So in terms of General Committee, the final thing I wanted to say was that the summary records of the General Committee are issued as A, BUR, session number, SR, summary record, and then the meeting number. So if you wanted to do some research on how the General Committee meetings were done in the past, you would just search for A, BUR, session number, SR1 for the first meeting. Let's move to the next slide, which is the report of the General Committee. So the General Committee meets on the Wednesday after the session starts on Tuesday. So it meets on Wednesday, reviews the memorandum of the SG, makes all the recommendation on the organization of work, the adoption of the agenda and allocation of item. And then the report of the General Committee goes to the GA for GA's consideration. The report of the General Committee every session is issued as A, session number 250, and it's taken up on the Friday, the week before the general debate starts. So the session starts on Tuesday, the General Committee meets on Wednesday, and then the report of the General Committee comes to the GA on Friday for the GA to take its decision on the items to be included in the agenda and on the allocation of items. Any additional items that are then, or any additional items that are considered by the General Committee, those reports are then issued as A, session number 250 Ed 1, the example of the one that happened at the 75th session for the appointment of the SG. So the report was issued as Ed 2. No, sorry, Ed 1. It was issued as Ed 1, and then it came to the GA for its consideration. When the GA takes up the recommendations of the General Committee, to include an item or not to include an item, so those are the recommendations coming from the General Committee, the GA can decide to overturn the recommendations of the General Committee. This happened at the 65th session. The General Committee recommended that the item entitled Protected Conflicts in the Guam Area and their implications for international peace, security, and development not be included in the agenda of the GA. But then when the report was taken up in the GA plenary, the recommendation of the General Committee was rejected by a recorded vote, and hence the item got included in the agenda. Another example is that the General Committee could decide without any vote by consensus to recommend the inclusion of an item in the agenda. But then when the report comes to the GA, a member state could ask for a vote on the recommendation of the General Committee, which happened at the current session, the 75th session, for the item on responsibility to protect. It was recommended by the General Committee for inclusion. There was no vote taken in the General Committee, but when the report was taken in the GA, there was a vote requested on that recommendation, but the item got included in the agenda, as opposed to the example, no, both sessions, 61st and the current session, the items were included in the agenda. Also, a final point to keep in mind is that when the General Committee report is considered in the GA in terms of inclusion of the item, in accordance with Rule 23 of the Rules of Procedure, the debate on the inclusion of an item in the agenda should be limited to 3 speakers in favor and 3 against the inclusion, and then the decision is taken. Final agenda. Once the GA approves the recommendations of the General Committee, it takes the decision. Next slide. The final agenda is issued as A session number 251. Any additional items that are included in the agenda are later on issued as A session number 251 Ed 1. And then once the session is over, the Secretariat issues a Rev 1, so A session number 251 Rev 1, which contains information on what resolutions and decisions were adopted under each item. So it's a kind of a reference document to keep handy in combination with the annotated agenda. Next slide. Also, after the GA looks at the recommendations of the General Committee in terms of adoption, then it looks at the allocation. Once the allocation decisions are taken on the allocation of items, we issue a document called the allocation of agenda items, and it's issued as A session number 252. And it goes, listing of items by each committee and the plenary. If there are any additional items that are included and they're allocated, then we issue the addendum to the 252 document. Next slide. To just final note that once the GA in its resolution 58316 decided that the agenda of the GA should be organized under headings that correspond to the priorities of the organization. So since the 59th session, the agenda is organized under these headings that are reflected on the screen, except there are some organizational items like the opening of the session, minute of silent prayer or meditation, the general debate that are not under any of the headings. But the agenda, the rest of the agenda items are organized under these headings. So once the agenda is adopted and after the general debate is over, the work of the main committees begin as well as the GA plenary. In the plenary, under each item, the GA holds a debate. And then at the time of the debate, if there is a draft resolution, so once we finish the debate, if there is a draft resolution, the GA adopts the draft resolution. And you will have explanation on what happens when a draft resolution is adopted by the GA, the steps that are involved. And so if we have a debate on an item and there is no draft resolution, before the assembly at that point. We just hold the debate. The GA just holds the debate and informs member states that we are just finishing with the debate stage. And once there are resolution or decisions under the item, we'll come back and resume consideration of this item to take action on the proposal that's before it. Once the GA has held the debate on an item and proposals under the item have been adopted and there is no future action expected under the item, the GA closes that item. For the plenary, the schedule of the GA plenary meetings, once it's approved by the president of the GA, it's get published on the website. So if you wanted to see the schedule, you would go to the GA website and you will see the listing of all the meetings as they get approved by the president of the GA. That, I guess, concludes my briefing, and I know I've gone a little bit over time, so if there are any questions, I'm happy to respond to questions, but that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Radhika. And apologies for the technical difficulties we had earlier at the beginning of your presentation. But if anyone has any questions for Radhika, we can take a few before moving on to the next session. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and I can read them aloud. Thank you.
Not sure. I saw.
So if there's no questions at the moment, we can move on to our next session, session 2, which is on preparing a draft resolution. We have 3 speakers for you in this section, but we're starting off with Miss Anne-Laure Michelet, who is the chief of the editing section of the Department of General Assembly and Conference Management. So, in this section, we will go through research precedents, parts of a draft resolution, terminology, and all of those things you need to know for drafting a resolution. Anne-Laure, if you are ready to take it away.
I'm ready. Thank you for the introduction, Ali, although I have to say it's very kind of you. I'm not the chief of the editing section. I am a longtime editor in the editing section here in New York. I've been here since 2009, but thank you, maybe one day. So it's very nice to be here with you all, and thank you delegates for joining us, and from many places in the world from what I can see. It's wonderful to have you all here. This is the first year that the editing section is participating in the UNITAR session on resolutions, and we're very happy to be here. We have in the past, and some of you may have seen me or colleagues of mine before, we've given presentations to, for example, the main committees of the General Assembly, usually in the conference room at the beginning of the session. So for me personally, I'm focal point for the 2nd committee. I've given presentations to the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd committees in the past, and colleagues of mine are focal points for different committees. And if you are working on a particular committee, you may well be in touch at the start of the session, I would say, with some of my colleagues. Just to give you a little bit of an introduction for those who are not so familiar, the editing section edits all the United Nations documents before they are translated, and that includes the draft resolution. So we take care of all parliamentary documentation, all the reports to the Secretary General, reports to special rapporteurs, communications from member states, almost any document you can imagine that the United Nations publishes in the 6 languages will come first to us. And our role is to make the documents that are received and that are going to be published clear, accurate, consistent, grammatically correct, make sure they are in conformity with the United Nations documentation standards and editorial standards, and especially and crucially, make sure they are translatable into the 5 other official languages. 90% of the work that we do in the editing section would be original English, but we also edit in French, Spanish, Arabic, Russian, Chinese. The draft resolutions, which we're talking about today, are normally edited, translated, formatted, and published in a very short time frame. Generally speaking, within 48 hours of receiving them, they will be published. So you can imagine that timeliness is of the essence in our work and the work of the translators. We therefore would always ask that, thank you, Ali, for putting up the presentation. We would always ask that delegates who are in charge of submitting the resolution, whether it's facilitators, sponsors, co-facilitators, etc., would share their contact information on any resolution they are submitting for processing, so that we can very promptly be in touch for any queries, any clarifications, and so on. You should also be aware that, as in many cases, you'll be updating perhaps a resolution that has existed from previous years, whether the immediate prior year, 2 years prior, and so on. And so the basis on which you're going to be working when that's the case is going to be the published text of the previous from ODS, the official document system. So that will be available under the ARES symbol of the previous resolution, which you would download from ODS in the Word file, and make any changes thereon. The Secretariat will ask you to submit a tracked changes version so that you can see exactly what has been updated and what has been removed, as well as a clean version, which is the version that we would work on. So that is for the draft resolution initial stage. You might also be aware that after adoptions, resolutions go through a final review, as do decisions, to ensure concordance in all the 6 languages. So at the stage of the concordance work, we would look at, for example, any changes that were made at the time of adoption, make sure they are reflected in the text, any oral corrections, oral revisions, and so on. We also might check that, just for example, source references, footnotes are updated if they need to be. The important thing that we would like everybody to really understand is that editors are not going to edit in order to change the meaning of any resolution. We really are looking simply for clarity, accuracy, translatability. So with that in mind, whenever something in a resolution might touch on a substantive matter, the editor who's working on that text will consult with the facilitator or whoever the contact person is on that document to make sure that we have clarity, that we can share information with the translators, and that we can be sure that what the text is saying really reflects what the message is supposed to be. Just to illustrate that, it can sometimes come down to commas, punctuation, and we're well aware of that, so we will definitely consult. And also to say that we are aware that there are times when certain aspects are too sensitive to really be touched, and that's very important information for us, because for one thing, it means we will know what can and cannot be changed, but for another point, it lets us pass on to the translators what must be reflected really faithfully and not altered compared to the original English, for example. To give you an example of a case in the past where we had over years a number of discussions with facilitators. We did have a resolution relating to combating torture, which for many years would read in one paragraph that the General Assembly was concerned with acts of torture, which actually literally means that it was involved in acts of torture. And clearly, this is not logically the case. However, just changing that word "with" to a different word took many years of negotiations between editors and facilitators. We tried year and year again. We're told often no. And I think after about 5 years of proposing edits to that very simple expression, we were actually able to get an approval to change it so that the resolution now reads truly what the United Nations would like to say in that respect. So we're very sensitive to how even a small word could be a big issue, and we certainly appreciate consultation as much as possible with the submitters. So why is it important that resolutions be edited? Well, for one thing, these documents are important international instruments that belong to the world, not even just to the United Nations. Many of them will be cited for years thereafter, perhaps even decades to come. And for that reason, they should be grammatically and factually correct. Ali, you can probably move on. Yes, thank you very much. So that they can be consistent and equivalent in the 6 languages. You can move to the next slide, please. Also to be aware that we are very conscious that the delegates, when the negotiations are going on with the text, are under a huge amount of time pressure to arrive at a text that can be submitted. Equally, when the text arrives to us for editing, we are under a huge time pressure to make sure that it is corrected and sent on to translation as quickly as possible. So we're always looking out for things like ambiguous language, where perhaps in a previous year, we can see that translators misinterpreted or took two different interpretations of what a certain sentence might mean. Those are the kind of things that we will try to highlight for you and try to get a little bit more clarification so that in the future, there is no ambiguity. Everybody translates to reflect the intended meaning. In that respect, the people who work in the editing section are working in at least 3 official languages. So in my case, English, French, and Spanish. And so we really are also looking for language that may perhaps be a mistranslation from another language into English, and where we can see words that might be like that, we will highlight those for you and perhaps see if we can find a better expression in English that would really translate the meaning that's sought. Beyond that, the editors for all parliamentary documents, whether those are reports or resolutions, we play the role of coordinators because we are in touch with the submitters, with you, but we are also in touch with the translators. So we are trying to make sure that the channel of communication goes in a very streamlined flow from the author of a resolution. We do all the checking that is required, and then the translators receive all the information they need to know to translate properly. It's also to avoid then having 5 language services independently, maybe trying to puzzle over some language that is confusing, difficult to translate. Our aim is to try and really enhance the productivity of everybody in the documentation division by solving problems, if there are any, at the very start of the process. One thing to note is that legal texts throughout the world are often edited both at the negotiation stage and following adoption. And for example, there are articles in the New York Times, you can see about this, about how Supreme Court decisions in the United States are edited after their issuance. So all that to say that the editing of resolutions and parliamentary decisions is something that is quite standard around the world. It's not just a UN-specific occurrence. So moving on then to the structure of a resolution, Ali, if you could skip on, please. We're going to talk about, first of all, the paragraphs. So you probably are aware, but a resolution is considered to be one long sentence. In the case of the General Assembly, beginning with the General Assembly, the paragraphs that follow thereafter are the preambular paragraphs. The paragraphs that are numbered are called the operative paragraphs. All of that means that the only period, the only full stop in a resolution should appear after the final word in the resolution, nowhere else in the whole text, other than in a footnote. So the preambular paragraphs serve to give the background to the action part of a resolution. And all paragraphs, whether preambular or operative, begin with a verb. So in the case of the preamble, you might have seen, they begin with a present, past, or perfect participle, or an adjective in italics. For example, concerned would be one that we would see sometimes. We'll circulate a document after today's presentation, which gives you a list of the examples of verbs that are used in resolutions, and you'll be able to see some of the ones that occur the most frequently. Operative paragraphs, as I mentioned, are numbered, and they express the opinions of the member states and the action that is required to be taken. The operative paragraphs must therefore begin with an action verb, not a participle. Something that's to do with the structure, which you also may have seen, is that when more than one paragraph in a row begins with the same verb, we use also and further for the second and the third iteration in order to give that sequence. So again, that's something that if it's omitted in a resolution that we receive, that is a standard edit. We will add also or further to the verb if that's required, if it's the same verb, 2 paragraphs or 3 paragraphs in a row. For any subparagraphs in a resolution, these are lettered with A, B, C in parentheses, as you can see now on the screen. The idea is that all subparagraphs should have a parallel syntactical structure. So for example, if you had a paragraph with a chapeau calls upon all states, subparagraph would be, for example, to take effective measures. Subparagraph B, to foster religious freedom. Subparagraph C, to encourage the representation. Subparagraph D, to make a strong effort, i.e. all the verb forms would be the same at the beginning of the subparagraphs. Similarly, if it was one that reaffirms the importance of the work of a commission, and in this connection, subparagraph A welcomes the initiatives of the commission. Subparagraph B expresses its appreciation to the Commission. So paragraph C takes note with interest of the comprehensive approach of the Commission. So again, we are keeping a parallel structure to any subparagraphs of the same paragraph. I'd like to skip on then to some changes that editors make to draft resolutions that you should be aware of. So we will of course check for correct titles and facts such as dates of meetings, dates of adoption of texts. We will correct grammar, syntax, correct, add or delete footnotes as necessary, and make very small adjustments to style that might be necessary to bring it into line with the United Nations editorial standards, and to make sure the text is understandable and translatable. Some of the most common corrections would be, for example, the titles of bodies, meetings, and conventions. So these will be checked against our terminology database, UNITAR. We would use in a resolution, because of its formality, the full title at first mention in both the preamble and the operative part of a resolution. And thereafter, if there is an approved shortened version, we would use that. Another thing that we make as a standard change is that acronyms, you have an example here of the shortened titles of bodies, meetings and conventions. For acronyms, we do not use those in resolutions. They will be spelled out in full the first time they occur in both the preamble and the operative part. And thereafter, if there's a shortened version of the title to which the acronym refers, that will be used instead. Dates. So dates, as I mentioned, will be checked and will be corrected if necessary. If an event that is mentioned in a draft resolution is going to take place between the time the draft is submitted and the time the resolution is adopted, then we may need to adjust the verbs accordingly by the time the resolution is adopted. That's something that we always look out for. Names of countries. This you may be familiar with from other parliamentary documentation. In United Nations documents and in resolutions, the short form of the names of countries is used. So generally that means no kingdom of, no republic of. We would use simply the short form, which is the one used for most purposes of the United Nations, including the names on tables and so on. For a list of the short names of countries, you can see those on the UN term portal. You have the address here on the slide in front of you. Another rule applies to the names of cities. So names of cities are followed by the country name unless the city is the capital, or unless in the case of New York, it's the location of a major duty station of the United Nations, in which case it also does not have a country name following it. So punctuation, as I mentioned, one thing to note is that the full stopper period only appears once at the very end of a resolution. That said, we pay very close attention to punctuation in resolutions because we are aware that sometimes a comma, a semicolon can have a very significant role to play in a sentence, and sometimes the omission thereof can be equally true. And that is something that we may well query and want to clarify with you, also because it is typically something that in translation needs to be really crystal clear in order to avoid any errors in interpretation. Personification. Personification is something that we avoid in that a resolution, a report, a document in itself does not decide, recommend, launch, convene, extend a mandate, or take any other action. It is the author or the body that is adopting that report that is taking the action. So, for example, if we see something such as General Assembly Resolution 6514 requested the Secretary General to report, we would change the General Assembly in its resolution 6514 requested the Secretary General to report. It's a very small change, but it does avoid errors of logic in the sentence that are caused by personification. One set of verbs that tends to be sometimes misused and that we will often consult on is about takes note and notes. So in general, we would use takes note when the body in question is taking note of a report, a statement, a decision. However, if we are saying observes, that the body is observing something, we simply will say notes. So we could note the convening of a meeting. We would not take note of the convening of a meeting. Equally, we would not note a report of the Secretary General. We would take note of that report. Another rule that we try to apply, and we will be in touch if we feel it's warranted to make that change, is that a body that is speaking, so in this case, for example, the General Assembly, should not take note or welcome its own past decision. It would generally take note or welcome the decisions of subsidiary bodies, perhaps, other entities in the United Nations system, other entities beyond the United Nations system, but generally should not welcome its own resolution or decision, because the very fact that it adopted a resolution or decision already means that it has welcomed its own decision. Another verb that we carefully look at is the verb reiterates. My apologies.
Sorry, everyone. I think she just had, it sounded like a fire alarm, so we'll give her a second just to make sure all is well. I just want to remind you, if you do have questions, to share them in the chat and we will collect them, and we will read many of them off at the end. Thank you.
I'm so sorry about that. Fire alarm unexpectedly ringing. Luckily, no need to leave. My apologies. If you wouldn't mind starting the presentation again, Ali. Thank you. Thank you very much. So yes, reiterates. Generally speaking, when we see a resolution paragraph starting with reiterates or reiterating, we will look for where has the General Assembly, for example, said this before. If it has never been said by the General Assembly, then reiterates would not be an appropriate verb to use. If it can be a little bit more generic, reaffirms may be a more neutral verb to use than reiterates, for example. Moving on to footnotes. I mentioned them briefly earlier. So source footnotes may be added during the editing process, may be deleted if they're not warranted, or may be updated if they require that. And again, that's done in consultation with the authors. So there are some documents that typically take a footnote, such as resolutions that are contained in the supplement of a body of ECOSOC. We would include a footnote to the supplement in which you would find that resolution. If there are conventions cited, treaties, and so on, those would get the footnote either for the convention itself, or if it's already in the treaty series, we would add the footnote for the treaty series, the appropriate reference there. Similarly, there are some documents that in the past would have been footnoted, but we no longer do so for various reasons. And this may happen in resolutions that perhaps have not been taken up for a few years. If we notice something that is no longer of a nature to be footnoted, then we would advise you that we would suggest deleting it going forward. Another small aspect of language that perhaps should be taken into account and is maybe not so obvious is that seasons of the year are something we avoid mentioning in parliamentary documents, whether that be reports or resolutions, simply because in the North and South hemispheres, the actual seasons are the opposite time of year. So they're not a useful frame of reference for most purposes. And so that's something that we would consult with you again on. Typically, we would suggest something like, for summer, we would suggest third quarter, or similar. If it can be possible to be more precise, we would simply ask for what is the correct month to cite for something, for an event, a decision, and so on. Another aspect of language that comes up a lot in resolutions, and which we're well aware is used with intent, is including an inter alia. Now, generally speaking, include and inter alia are read to mean the same thing. So if we see them both together, we would usually be in touch with you to suggest that one of them be deleted, because otherwise we're dealing with redundant language. There are, of course, occasions where both are needed for certain reasons, but it's certainly something that we will try to highlight to you. Sometimes we also see that this happens when a text, for example, has changed over the years, and at some point including was needed, but perhaps is no longer needed. At a later point, somebody added inter alia and never looked at, do we still need both of these? And we see that over time with resolutions where they've had changes that perhaps had not been queried in the past. So we will certainly be in touch for aspects like those. Next slide, please, Ali. So Before I conclude, I just wanted to say that the editing section is available for assistance if we can be of any assistance to you, whether you are prior to negotiations, in the middle of negotiations, and certainly we will be the ones who are in touch with you when we receive your texts. If we can ever be of assistance in that respect, feel free to please get in touch. On this screen, you can see our main email address, editingny@un.org, and our main phone number. You will also see on the next screen some resources that we would point you to for guidance on United Nations practice. The first one being the United Nations Editorial Manual Online. You can see the link here. There used to be a French version of this, but that is no longer online. So this one is about content in English. The next one will be the terminology database, UNITAR. And again, that usually has terms available in the 6 languages. So it can be quite helpful when you are looking at perhaps text that has been proposed from a non-English speaker, where perhaps there are some texts, titles that are not available in English, that may be able to help you find what the correct English would be for those. And then for the purposes of downloading a previous year's resolution, the official document system. So documents.un.org or ods.un.org is where you can download the Word versions of those prior documents. From my side, that is it. As I said, I will be circulating to Ali and Pelayo to share with you all our document that also contains some lists of frequently used verbs and alternate verbs that we would suggest. I think I noticed a couple of questions in the chat. Ali, would you like me to take questions now, or would you rather first move on to Juanes and Shalom?
Yeah. We can go ahead and do some questions now. Sure.
Okay, very good. So I saw a question from Camila Ortiz. Do these principles for drafting apply to all UN organizations? That's a good question. I can't speak for all UN organizations. What I can say is that as far as the organizations that have an editing section in the duty stations, so New York, Geneva, Vienna, Nairobi, yes, those are the practices that apply. In that texts will not only be translated, but there will be an editing step, usually prior to translation or parallel with translation, depending on the duty station, the deadlines, and so on. The drafting principles and the editorial guidelines that you can see on the editorial manual apply to all duty stations, also to, for example, the regional commissions, ESCAP, ESCWA, ECA, ECE, ECLAC. The UN portal for UN term, again, that is something that all duty stations use, so they would refer to the same terminology database as we do. And ODS is where the official versions of any of those published texts from any of the duty stations would be published. So generally speaking, for the main duty stations, yes, those rules apply. Then when you get into different organizations such as OHCHR, ICAO, the various Nairobi conventions and so on, you may find that there are slightly different rules. Not all of them have an editing section, for example. There was a question from Benjamin Okechukwu, I hope I'm pronouncing that okay, saying, what is really the rationale for numbering UN resolutions? I think you are referring to ARES symbol, is that correct with your question? So for example, ARES 75-1, is that what you're asking about? Essentially, in any given session, the first resolution in the session will be 1, and then generally speaking, they are numbered thereafter as they become as they are adopted by the General Assembly. Occasionally, a certain number will be saved for a particularly landmark resolution, but generally speaking, the order is simply as adopted. If you're talking about numbering of paragraphs, essentially there we are distinguishing between preamble, which is, as I mentioned, the background to a resolution, what has happened in the past, what other bodies may have said, and then the action part. So, which are the points that need to be taken action on? And then that is helpful because, as you may be aware, in reports of Secretary General, in reports of different panels, in reports of subsidiary bodies, we will have references to, in paragraph X of resolution X, the General Assembly or the Secretary General or whomever it might be was requested to take some action. So it's for reference purposes that we would use paragraph numbers. I hope that answers your question, but please feel free to let me know if that didn't. Yes, a fire alarm, Vida, indeed. My apologies. I see my colleague Matt from OHCHR, Matt McParland, is just responding that for the Human Rights Council, the same procedures apply. Thank you, Matt, for adding that. I have a question from the Malta DPR, Francesca. Let's see, in case of a disagreement between the editors and the lead negotiator or core group, what happens? The lead negotiators, the core group remain the authors. So editors will propose suggested edits. We will try to look for clarification. That said, if something cannot be changed, then we will communicate that to the translators and we will communicate that to our fellow editors so that everybody is aware of something that was, discussed and had to be left as is. So that's why communication is a very important part of this whole process. We encourage you to share with us as much information as you can about why something can't be changed. As I said, what we've found in the past is that certain years, certain things can't be changed, and over time, the same arguments can be discussed again and again, and eventually at some point, a change may be possible. So generally speaking, the editors never give up in highlighting things that we can see are causing problems, in looking at past translations and seeing where were things misaligned, where is there a clear misunderstanding that could hopefully be clarified. And even when things can't be changed, it is really, really critical for us to understand the background, for you to share the clarification of what is particularly sensitive, what is particularly difficult to change, because all the services will be able to record that. And in the following year, we will look back at the previous text and see what was discussed, where were the difficulties. It's something that just helps the entire process from year to year. Let me see. Benjamin, you asked again, how efficacious are resolutions when compared to conventions? That's probably not a question for me to answer. I would say that's probably maybe a question more for member states to answer, as far as the adoption of text and how many people have adopted a convention and the requirements for putting those into action. Maybe somebody else in the panel this morning will want to comment on that. Catherine, why aren't parameter paragraphs numbered? It would be neater and easier for reference. I don't disagree with you. I think probably if they were to be numbered, we would then need two different numbering systems. One for the preamble, which doesn't request any action, and a different one than for the operative where the action is requested, because it's all to do with later on the references you want to make to where action was requested, where a decision was taken, when something was adopted. You really need to be able to pinpoint the exact paragraph, and for that we need a numbering system. Vida, you have another question. Are the editors assigned randomly, or can the authors pick? Generally speaking, editors are assigned as available. So just speaking for New York, we have a team of about 20 people in the editing section. There are a certain number of editors, myself included, who have a lot of experience with resolutions and who are both editors and revisers of resolutions. Every resolution is both edited and revised, i.e. there is always two pairs of eyes that will be looking at the text before it goes, just given the sensitivity of these texts. And so as far as assigning them, we will ideally assign to people who are obviously experienced perhaps in a subject matter. For example, I am focal point for second committee, so I will generally try to look either edit or revise the second committee as much as I can, but that doesn't mean that I won't edit fifth committee, fourth committee, first committee, etc. We are all expected, given the small size of the team, to be able to do everything. But our fallback is that we have a reviser for every resolution, so that even if the person is not specifically very knowledgeable in a given committee's work, for example, there will always be somebody else behind them who will look at that and make sure that we are not making any untoward changes, or that we've consulted appropriately. And can the authors pick? Generally not. Even within the Secretariat, people who are slotting documents and have an annual report, it's very rare that they could say, I want this editor to edit my report. That they can express their request. Whether it's possible to do is very, very rare, unfortunately, just given our workload and deadline. So I hope I've responded to everything so far. I don't want to take up any more time from Shalom and Juanes. Ali, everything okay from your side?
Yep, everything is great. Thank you so much, and Laura, for that.
Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure to be with you this morning. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. We're looking forward to seeing you again sometime soon.
I love it.
Thank you. Bye. So next up, we have, just the continuation of the preparing a draft resolution section. Here we have with us Mr. Wannes Lind, who is the Associate Intergovernmental Affairs Officer at the General Assembly Affairs Branch, as well as Ms. Shalom Teamo with the Program Planning and Budget Division. I hand the floor over to you, Wannes.
Thanks so much, Ellie. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, colleagues, thank you so much for having us. Shalom and I said that maybe it'd be best just to put the two aspects of the other two presentations in a single one, just for ease of reference. And you've just gotten a very thorough explanation from Laura in editing section in terms of the structure of draft resolutions, of proposals. And so we just want to walk you through what happens procedurally when a specific proposal is submitted. So what you here see is the overall process for the GA plenary, which is what I'm talking to as resolutions focal point for the GA plenary. It is pretty much the same thing across the board. For all the main committees, you'd find a very similar process. There is some minor variation, but for today, we'll spare you the details. So submission of a proposal is pretty straightforward. It's done via email these days. You don't have to submit a proposal in writing with hard copy, signatures and the like. It can just be done via email to the General Assembly Affairs Branch. And I'll share you some details in terms of guidelines and the like later in this presentation. What is of importance is at the time of submitting a proposal, you indicate who the original proposals of the draft resolution are, which is for you as main proponent to determine. And so if you indicate that the following 47 member states are sponsors of the proposal, we take that at time of submission, and we reflect these 47 member states on the proposal itself. You submit to us, that date is submission. And from that point on, that triggers this entire review process. Step 2, co-sponsorship of your proposal. Whilst there are main sponsors of your proposal that you indicate at time of submission, your proposal can be opened for co-sponsorship at any point in time, both before the plenary meeting in which your proposal is considered, as well as during the meeting. And we'll have a slide on that in a second. Editing of the proposal, this is what Laura explained in detail. I'll not have to give more detail, but just to confirm that indeed it is your sovereign right, as the DPR of Malta asked, to propose any language to the Assembly. And so suggestions will come from us in terms of the proposals write-up. But in the end of the day, it is your delegations or group of countries, sovereign rights, to make the call in terms of whether something is acceptable or not. And so we really do defer to you there. But of course, we have our editorial standards, which we uphold. At the same time as the editing is ongoing, the meeting in question will be scheduled. And so upon submission of your proposal, we will start consulting with the Office of the President, or in the case of main committees with the Bureau, and suggest a consideration date for your proposal. And it's important to note that this only happens upon submission. So we do repeatedly get questions, when will my proposal be considered if I submit? And the answer to that question, unfortunately, is that unless a proposal is submitted, we have no information as to when the proposal will be taken up. So it's really your submission that triggers the scheduling of the consideration of your proposal during a formal meeting. And you see step 5 at the bottom left, review of program budget implications. Similarly, and we'll talk about this in a lot more detail, upon submission, the review of program budget implications takes place. This is the budgetary review where, on the basis of your text, colleagues in the Department for Management, Strategy, Policy and Compliance, DMSPC, review the text for budgetary implications. The formal review only takes place after you submit your proposal. And then for the last step, obviously, at the end of this process is the meeting itself. We will ask you questions from the Secretariat of the General Assembly in terms of what your expectations are. Are you expecting any amendments, requests for a vote? More importantly, would your delegation wish to introduce the proposal, which is optional? It is not required to introduce your proposal, but that will be up to you. Are there any other things that you expect to happen during the meeting? I understand you have the benefit of our senior legal officer, Ms. Tomoko Yawata, in the afternoon, who will walk you through the rules of procedure. And so we'll keep it light on the procedural front when it comes to the in-person part of this process. So, submission of a proposal. As said, proposals can be submitted via email, no more hard copies, no more signatures. We really do not have to meet face to face in order for a delegation to submit the proposal. On the right, you see what we call the submission guidelines. This will be shared with you after this presentation, which summarizes this in detail and adds some other elements. Written notice for the submission of a proposal is though required. Oral submissions do not count. We need an email, and that written notice is required 5 days before consideration. This takes into account Rule 78, which we reproduce below, which says that no proposal shall be discussed or put to a vote unless copies of it have been circulated to all delegations no later than the day preceding the meeting. For GA plenary, that's the rule. For main committees, the rule is slightly different. But when it comes to the plenary, that means that your text needs to be out in all 6 languages the day before the formal meeting takes place. In order for us to meet the obligations we have as a secretariat under Rule 78, we require your submission 5 working days before consideration. That's the timeline. And then in that process, we go through different steps that we'll speak to in a second, including, as Anne-Laure mentioned, editing, the budgetary review, and so on and so forth. As Anne-Laure mentioned, the base text is important. Base text just means, is this a rollover from a past draft resolution, or have you made changes? We would hope to receive these changes in track changes so that we ensure we keep the lineage of your text intact and that we have all the information at our disposal when the text is being edited. If no base text is available, in other words, your proposal is new, then we would ask you to identify an agenda item or multiple agenda items under which you're submitting your proposal. We do get a series of questions on this. How do I determine the agenda item under which a proposal is to be submitted? That is entirely your sovereign right. So there are no rules that determine under which item you are to submit your proposal. It simply is up to you to say, okay, item 19, sustainable development. My text relates to sustainable development, therefore I submit it under that item. Or you could say, well, for years, proposals under cooperation between the OECD and the United Nations have been submitted under agenda item 130. Therefore, this time around, I will also submit it under item 130. There isn't really much that we can offer in terms of practical advice here, in terms of what to take, other than just to look at past practice. In terms of consideration of your proposal, you'd received the presentation from Radhika earlier this morning in terms of the agenda process. And so it does matter under which agenda item you submit your proposal in terms of when and where it is considered. But in terms of your submission, it is entirely up to you. Moving on to co-sponsorship of a proposal. So as said, proposals can be open for co-sponsorship. There are 2 ways of doing this. Via eDelegate, which is our online platform, and the guidelines on the site will give you the background in terms of how to do this, as well as for co-sponsorship during the meeting. They both can happen in parallel. You can choose one and not the other, or you can choose not to have any co-sponsorship of your proposal at all. And so that's an important distinction to make. So you can either open it for sponsorship during the meeting, which means your ambassador will press a microphone button and indicate that a proposal is to be sponsored, or you do it via the online platform. And then that gets reflected on the original proposal. We do get questions on the State of Palestine and the Holy See and their rights to sponsor proposals from time to time. So we're copying the references at the bottom. State of Palestine has the right to co-sponsor draft resolutions and decisions on Palestinian and Middle East issues. The Holy See has the right to co-sponsor draft resolutions and decisions that make reference to the Holy See. But the one important thing to underline here is that it is for the proponent, for the submitter of the proposal to determine whether this is a text on Palestinian and Middle East issues, or whether this text makes reference to the Holy See. And so especially on 52-250, the first resolution, we would look to you as the proponent of the text to say this resolution should be open to the State of Palestine in keeping with resolution 52-250. And myself or any other resolution focal points in the main committees would reach out to you and seek your confirmation that this is the case. Usually this is a trivial issue. In some cases, it is a non-trivial issue, and then it would be for you to make determination. All right, then we get to program budget implications. And before handing over to Shalom, who has far more expertise on this particular issue than I will ever have, procedurally, there are a few things just to point out in terms of how this works in the General Assembly. And this is mostly captured in terms of recommendations from the General Committee, the Bureau of the General Assembly, which are adopted at the start of each session by the General Assembly. And this is not an easy reference, but this is a reference I would really want to draw your attention to, is what you see on the side, because this document, A75-250, which are the recommendations of the General Committee to the GA, govern a lot of procedural issues that unfortunately we don't have the time to talk about today, from anything related to the identification of new international days to recommendations on the observer status of intergovernmental organizations, as well as the review of program budget implications. So that reference on the side is quite useful. Just quoting 4 paragraphs, Rule 153, which we'll talk about in a second, which means that the GA cannot do anything until such point that Fifth Committee and ACABQ have reviewed the text for budgetary implications. So everything in the GA plenary is on hold until such time. Second, para 71, we cannot offer formal advice on budgetary implications until a proposal is formally submitted. And the emphasis here is on formal. So from time to time, colleagues across the secretariat in budget and technical secretariats receive questions, what does this mean? Is this going to trigger PBIs or not? That will always, any response to that will always be informal. And so just to say that, we have to hold back in keeping with what the GA asks us to do per that paragraph, per the GA decision. And then I will now hand over to Shalom, which I see on. Shalom, over to you.
Thank you, Wannes and Alison. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, colleagues, it's a pleasure to be with you today. By way of brief introduction, I work in the budget division, and as Wannes alluded to, in terms of our role in the process, in line with Rule 153 and 154, any draft resolution that would potentially have financial or budgetary implications, whether for the current period or for the future, we would have to submit an indication to the main committee or the GA plenary that there are financial implications, and therefore there's a process which I will explain, hopefully in detail, on this. So Wannes, can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is a flow chart that shows the review of program budget implications for the GA plenary. There's a process for the GA plenary, and there's also a process for the main committees. So in the GA plenary, if we start from the left, the budget division, which I work for, what happens is when the GA plenary receives a draft resolution that's tabled, they would share that with us. We would review that draft resolution together with departments of the Secretariat that fall under the regular budget to determine whether there are potential financial implications. If there are potential financial implications, then we follow the 2 arrows where we have if yes. So what we do, because this is a GA plenary, we would issue a formal PBI to the Fifth Committee, who's the Administrative and Financial Committee. And that goes through the Advisory Committee for Administrative and Budgetary Questions, ACABQ, who reviews the PBI first, then the Fifth Committee, then it goes to the GA for adoption of the resolution. And that's the first row you see at the top. We would issue an oral statement if the financial implications of the related text in the resolution would impact a future budget period. So for example, if a resolution is presented now that impacts the budget period for 2022, we would issue an oral statement. And in that oral statement, we would explain that there are potential financial implications for a future budget period, and therefore we would, at the appropriate time, issue a revised estimates report. So upon receipt of that, the GA plenary would adopt the resolution. If there are no financial implications, we would just advise the Secretariat of the General Assembly that there are no budgetary implications, and the GA would proceed to adopt the resolution. So this slide here is mainly the process for the GA plenary. The next slide, we would talk about the main committees, i.e. first, second, up to the sixth committee. So it's the same process where the committees would share their draft resolutions with us, the budget division. We would then share those with the respective departments to review and determine if there are financial implications. In this case, what happens is, and for example, if the first committee issues a draft resolution and there are financial implications, we would advise the first committee that there are financial implications. If it is for the current budget period, we would issue a PBI. And that PBI would be issued under the symbol A/C.1 for the first committee. The first committee, upon receipt of that PBI, would then adopt the resolution or amend the resolution, the draft resolution. Once they have adopted the draft resolution, then we would then proceed to change that PBI to a fifth committee symbol. So it goes to the fifth committee for review of the PBI document. And that, of course, goes to ACABQ before the fifth, and then to the GA to adopt the financial implications resolution by the fifth committee. In the same manner, if it's for a future budget period, then we would issue an oral statement to the main committee, in this case, the first committee. We would advise the committee that this would impact a future budget period. That oral statement is then read by the Secretariat of the main committee, and then the main committee can proceed to adopt or amend the draft resolution. And similarly, if there are no financial implications, then we would just advise the main committee, and then the committee proceeds to adopt. So what do we usually include in an oral statement or a PBI? So what we would generally include in these two documents is which sections of the regular budget would incur financial or budgetary implications, additional resources, or a reduction in resources, which paragraphs of the draft resolution would trigger the PBI. So for example, we would say in the first operative paragraph, the fourth session of the conference in New York would consist of 20 meetings. So what you see in the green highlighted text are the operative paragraphs that we would reference in the oral statement or PBI. And what you see highlighted in blue are the activities that would occur as a result of that operative paragraph. And as a result of the activities, we would indicate an amount. So in this case, if you go to, say, the third paragraph of this, we would say related requirements in the amount of 595,800 would be approved under Section 2, for the fourth session, to support the fourth session. So we would give a bit of information and details where there are, if we have them available at that point in time, we would present this in the oral statement or the PBI. And then we would give an indication, for example, in this case, an oral statement, because it's issued for a future period, we would say, and that's the text in orange, should the GA adopt the draft resolution, the Secretariat would present a revised estimates report to the main session of the 76th session, detailing the additional requirements needed under the proposed program budget. So in essence, the main elements that we would present are which sections are impacted, which paragraphs trigger the budgetary implications, what activities would be covered, how that would impact the existing or future budget, and what is the related GA action. Juanes, can we go to the next slide, please? So to recap, if the budget report has been issued already, in this case, we have issued the proposed program budget for 2022. That budget is currently reviewed by the Advisory Committee on Administrative and Budgetary Questions, which is the ACABQ. In that case, any draft resolutions that would impact that the 2022 budget proposal, we would issue an oral statement indicating that there is financial implications, and if it's adopted in the current session, we would submit a revised estimate report in the 76th session. So any potential draft resolution would either trigger a PBI or a revised estimates report if there are financial implications that would impact the budget. And as indicated earlier, the PBI and the oral statement, in essence, you have the same elements included in there, but for a PBI, you'd have a section that's dedicated to the General Assembly action, right? So what are we asking the General Assembly to do? Approve resources, for example, approve resources in a respective section, approve posts in the respective section, or to note that, you know, there are changes in structure, etc. On the right, we have a few examples of PBIs, which is program budget implications, and a few examples of revised estimates. In some cases, the PBIs will be restricted for a single budget period, which in our case is an annual period that's based on a calendar year. In other cases, the draft resolution may trigger financial implications over 5 years. So what we would do in that particular situation, and there's an example there, AC5 7513, where we ask for approval of resources for the current period, but we also give an indication of the potential budgetary amounts for the future period. And this is just to provide member states with an indication of the related budgets in future period, total cost of the resolution in its entirety. So that really is the main reasons why we would indicate that. And an example of a revised estimates report is reflected in A75608, which relates to the revised estimates report for ECOSOC. And the one below that is really for the Human Rights Council. In respect of the latter, you know, during the year, ECOSOC and Human Rights Council would meet, but we would continue to provide oral statements to the, in this example, it's the Human Rights Council advising of potential budgetary implications of their draft resolutions. In resolution 63263, the General Assembly requested that we submit one report in a year, and that's at the end of the year, that provides a summary or tally of all the decisions, resolutions of the Human Rights Council that have financial implications and the related amounts for those, so that they can see it in one report as opposed to multiple PBIs. So that's a change in procedure, but that's also driven by a request from the General Assembly. Juanes, the next slide, please.
You want me to go back?
That's it. Yeah. So what examples, just to end, we wanted to provide a few examples of language that may trigger a PBI. These are more definite requests. For example, if there's language in the operative paragraphs that request the SG to submit a report or establish new capacity to support a certain activity, or carry out a certain conference, expand, increase, decides to convene an open-ended working group. These generally these this language would trigger potential budgetary implications. And as Juanes had mentioned earlier on, within existing resources, if there's a request to absorb this within existing resources, it does not necessarily preclude budgetary implications. And the reason for that is the fifth committee is the main committee tasked with review of budgetary and administrative issues. So that's something where we say, you know, that would warrant a detailed review, especially if this comes from the main committees, where we would say, okay, can the department really absorb this within existing resources? And if they can't, then this is something that we would present in a PBI. I think the exception to that is if it's presented by the GA plenary, because that is the GA plenary, it's within their purview. So in this case, we would actually have to really review this request, but it is the GA plenary. So in this essence, we would abide by whatever the membership advises us. In terms of languages that in principle would not trigger a PBI, it's language where in a draft resolution, they would request the SG to continue to report, to maintain. So the words continue, to maintain support, to make efforts, the assumption here is to continue to report means there are already financial provisions in the budget, and this is an existing report. To maintain is to maintain whatever activities that a program is currently undertaking, and therefore indirectly it already has financial resources to support that activity. Calls upon the SG and invites. These two references generally would not, in principle, would not trigger a PBI unless there's more specific language included in these sentences that would say calls upon the SG to fund this certain activity from the regular budget. So if they mention regular budget is, or if there's a stronger language there that talks about sustainability of funding, etc., then this would warrant a review of the text to determine whether there are potential implications or not. And if they are, we would inform the committees accordingly. On the right are the regulatory frameworks that govern this process. So, you have rules 153 and 154, the GA resolutions, the financial regulations and rules, and the program planning regulations and rules. So I think that's it, right, Juanes, in terms of slides. So we just wanted to share with you an overview of the whole process, and we're available to respond to any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both Shalom and Juanes for those presentations. I hope we can work with the two of you again sometime soon. It's fabulous. Thank you so much for your expertise. If we have any questions from participants, I invite you to put them in the chat and we can read them off to our panelists.
Ali, shall we try to take the earlier question on the convention?
Absolutely, yes. If you feel you can answer it, absolutely.
So my answer is going to be a procedural answer here, is that we really do not make any distinction between the different terms or concepts or references that are made in various draft resolutions. The GA rules of procedure don't give us as Secretariat any instruction to treat any of these differently. So in keeping with what we were mentioning earlier, sovereign right of member states to propose any language. We recently had a case where a member state decided to submit a request for the establishment of a trust fund through a draft resolution. Trust funds are ordinarily not established through a draft resolution. There's no procedural requirement for that to be the case. But of course, member states in their sovereign rights are free to propose that, to move for the assembly to do accordingly. The same would apply to, say, conventions or any other terminology that member states would like to submit to the assembly. And so as such, they're all draft resolutions, they're all proposals before the assembly. And as such, we wouldn't be able to make any distinction in terms of whether one thing would be more than the other, or what the internal relationship should be.
So we did have one question just come in. Are all resolutions related to international requests PBI? That.
So I think this pertains to the proclamation that the Assembly does from time to time to proclaim certain days, international days. And so that would all depend on the language of the draft resolution, whether that would carry,
Welcome back.
whether that would carry PBI or not. I don't want to stick my head out too far, but I think for most proclamations that we've seen recently, they were all without program budget implications, because it's just an adding to a record. So to a record of international days. So that usually not trigger any implications. Shalom.
Thank you, Ali. Can I intervene, jumping in, because I was following the conversation. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Anna and Lord, for the presentation. I just wanted to tackle the issue of efficacious resolutions when compared to conventions, and this is a more something of international law. You have to take into the mind the preparing a convention is a different process than doing a resolution in the United Nations framework, General Assembly, Main Committee, Security Council of ECOSOC. So as you know, resolutions are considered by us or by you member states for member states in General Assembly, Main Committees, and in ECOSOC recommendations. Resolution adopted for the Security Council, depending on the charter in which you adopted them, Charter 6 or Charter 7, they are kind of a more binding resolutions. Conventions, on the other hand, are a more elaborated, agree documents with where they enter in force. They are different processes of adopting a convention. They became binding to member states. Conventions, for example, can take between 1 year to 10 years to be agreed on by member states. That was the convention of Vienna Convention of International Law, or Vienna Convention of the Treaties, or the Vienna Convention of Privileges and Immunities Vienna Convention of Privileges and Immunities for international relations. So conventions are a more elaborated process. They are normally discussed with the International Law Commission. They are related to international law. They are international law trade commission if they are related to commerce or trade or things like that. When those conventions are approved, there is a process in which member states have to ratify this convention. And it's certain in the convention where the number of ratifications are achieved, then this convention became binding for member states. This takes several years to pass. And then the United Nations is a depository of mostly of those conventions or specialized agencies within the United Nations system. So we are talking about two different legislative processes. The resolutions are merely adopted every year following the agenda of the General Assembly, triggering a reporting process from the Secretariat and triggering also development of the agenda of the United Nations. After September 2015, we adopted the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals are every year there is a different following up of the topics of the SDGs in the second committee, in the third committee, in the sixth committee, and things like that. Following this process implies a new mandate for the Secretariat, for the Secretary General to produce a report across the board of the UN system. Remember, the UN system and the resolutions are not just those decisions making in the United Nations here in New York, sometimes it has to do with the World Trade Organization, with the World Health Organization, with the ILO, with the FAO, depending on the configuration of the resolutions in the main committees. That's why you have main committees, 6, first, second, third, fifth for the United Nations budget, and things like that. So there is two different processes. How the efficacy of these two legal instruments is totally different. So I will not really at this moment compare the process of discussing and adopting a convention with the United Nations resolutions. Resolutions are a kind of more short-term implications, recommendations to be followed by member states within the framework of the General Assembly. Security Council is different, but it's the only way in which member states can follow the development of the topics and the agenda of the United Nations. Conventions are totally different configurations, and you have to agree. Sometimes you have to prepare a kind of methodological resolution in order to start working on an international convention. Convention of the Law of the Sea in Montego Bay, for example, they have a long negotiation process until it was adopted in 1982 in Montego Bay in Jamaica. And so there are two different legislative processes, if I put it in this very simple way. And we cannot compare the efficacy because a convention basically norms the international relations among obligations among member states when they are adopted. So I hope this clarifies. I don't want it to confuse you, but there are two different elements on the conventions and resolutions in the United Nations. Sometimes in order to negotiate a convention, you require a resolution as a first step in the United Nations, the methodological resolution. Without that, you don't agree to do that. Sometimes it's just an special agencies without coming to the United Nations General Assembly by his own constituency body who decided among the same member states are presented, those decided, well, we need something international legal framework to do this. And then they start to negotiate it in that process. So these are the differences among a resolution and a convention in the very layman terms. Maybe we should consider that for future trainings. But anyway, I just wanted to clarify that because you cannot compare the two instruments for saying something. And both of them are kind of legislative documents. So I stopped there. I don't want it to confuse more.
Thank you, sir. And I think it's a very good point in terms of the relationship between resolutions and conventions. Most recent example that participants might be aware of were the discussions on the elaboration of the convention in relationship to cybercrime. Big discussions that happened a few weeks ago, which of course were a resolution that put in place a preparatory process that would allow member states in New York and in Vienna to start discussions on the potential adoption of a convention, which is a process that can take multiple years. And so a resolution paved the way for these discussions on a convention. Maybe to pick up on a different point, a different question that was raised in terms of the numbering of draft resolutions. And to give you now the perspective from the technical secretariat, and feel free also to discuss this, of course, with our colleague from OLA, Tomoko, who will surely be talking about the implementation of Rule 91. The numbering of resolutions, frankly, is not the most interesting question. It does not matter so much at the end of the process, whether a resolution is numbered resolution 282, the one on cybercrime I just mentioned, 281 or 283. But what does matter a much bigger deal is the submission, the sequence in terms of submission of proposals. And there the Secretariat is indeed governed by Rule 91, which says that proposals on the same question are to be considered, unless the GA decides otherwise, in the sequence that they were submitted. And most cases that is completely non-contentious. So it doesn't quite matter whether something is L87, L88, or L89. But in the context of certain negotiations, and we actually recently had one in terms of the ECOSOC HLPF review, where there were questions in terms of the sequencing and how they were to be considered. Similarly, when we had the discussions on cybercrime that we just mentioned, a delegation actually went as far as to move under Rule 91 for one proposal that was submitted later to be given priority treatment so it could be considered first. And so this sequencing is usually non-contentious, but it does matter when proposals are being submitted, and that's where this numbering actually becomes a rather contentious issue. Back to you, Ali.
Thank you so much, Juanes, and Shalom and Ambassador Suazo as well for contributing to that discussion. So next up, we have session 3 on negotiations. Here with us today is Mr. Mario Zambrano. He's the first secretary of the Permanent Mission of Ecuador to the United Nations. Mario, are you with us? Oh, there you go.
Okay.
Perfect.
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here virtually and share my personal experiences as a facilitator of a few resolutions in the past. Okay, we can follow the slides. Okay, well, first I'm going to talk about the role of the main sponsor or the facilitator here. Well, the main sponsor or the facilitator of the resolution consults with member states and holds informal negotiations on the draft before tabling the best version possible. Any delegate in the committee can write a resolution. The author of a resolution is called a sponsor. The facilitator or the coordinator of the negotiations is the one who leads the process until the text is adopted by the committee or the General Assembly. Of course, during the process, the facilitator conducts several rounds of consultations with member states on a draft resolution or decision before its formal adoption. What are the main objectives during a negotiation here? Drafting and negotiation are closely related because the subject of the negotiations often involves agreeing on the words that are used to describe an action that is to be taken on a particular agenda item. As you know, negotiation is the art of reaching an agreement. The basic aim is to make sure that other participants have sufficient incentives to agree on the resolution. Each delegation will have many objectives they want to achieve during negotiations. But as the facilitator or the main sponsors in the resolution, the only way to achieve your delegation's objectives is through negotiation, is to reach an agreement with other delegations. The next slide, please, Ali. Thank you. There are elements to consider by the facilitator that ensure the success of negotiations. First of all, we have the background information. You have to study a little bit the subject of the resolution because member states and other delegations will ask questions regarding the rationale, the inclusions of new language of the resolutions, the paragraphs. So that's something important is the preparation is to be well informed, both about the issues to be negotiated and the positions of the countries regarding the resolution. To prepare the zero draft of the resolution, the facilitator can do it using last year's resolution, incorporating new elements, but the facilitator can also turn for support to specialized technical areas of the United Nations, such as DESA, for example, or units in charge of the topic related to the resolution. Take into account that the SG reports, the reports from the Secretary General, are a good source to get new elements in order to include in the resolution. Prepare the zero draft using paragraphs based on agreed language, sources, and if necessary, explain the rationale of the new language. Those elements are very important during the informals. For example, during the elaboration of the zero draft, you could include technical updates and new paragraphs and have to be included, which have to be based on agreed language. It can be verbatim or use ideas from large documents such as the 2030 Agenda, the Addis Ababa Plan of Action, previous resolutions, reports of the Secretary General, among others. But it's very important for delegations that that you could base your new proposals on agreed language and, of course, take into account the sources. If the issues are not controversial, delegations will not oppose updates or new language so drastically. So as long as it's backed up with agreed language, sources, and if necessary, explains the rationale for the proposals for the proposal properly. So this is something very important to take into account. One more thing that I would like to mention is that it's very important to consider that negotiations starts before the first informal meeting with member states. Previous meetings with key players, it's a good step. For example, it's recommended that before the first informal meeting, you could arrange previous approaches with member states that you perceive with more interest on the resolutions. This with two purposes. First, to get support during negotiations, and secondly, to improve the zero draft of the resolution with more proposal to strengthen the language. Of course, the group of friends, for example, they could give you a feedback in order to strengthen the language that you are proposing in your resolution. For example, a meeting could convene with a group of friends on a given issue before negotiations begin. Within the United Nations, there are several group of friends for children and SDG, climate change, disaster risk reduction, indigenous peoples, etc. Almost every issue has a like-minded group or a group of friends. Next slide, please. I would like to share with you some tips during the informal meetings that we could take into account. As I mentioned before, the zero draft should be presented with track changes and sources. At the meetings, there are what is called informal consultations meetings, which we allow us to negotiate with member states. It's recommended that the first draft circulated includes track changes and sources for each paragraph. This is something that delegations request to have even before the first meeting. The delegation also, it's important that you are going to receive comments and new elements during the informals. But it's very important that delegations that propose new language or have comments on particular issues should be present and should present their proposals in the room. This is very important. A first reading of the resolution can also be done if it's not too long. Of course, at the first informal meeting, new updates and language are presented, as well as changes made. A first reading of a resolution can also be done if it's not too long. If it's completely a new resolution that you are going to introduce or present, you could share a concept note on the resolution with delegations. During the first informal, you have to present a tentative work program, a roadmap on the resolution that includes a schedule of meetings, date, place, and time, deadlines for receiving new language, etc. This is important. It's trying to organize your work as a facilitator during the negotiations. The roadmap gives information and people that follows the informals could organize better. Some other colleagues, they mentioned the PBIs. This is very important that we could have. It's important to note that if there are program budget implications, PBIs in the proposed new language, several delegations will not allow paragraphs to be agreed upon until verified by the Secretariat of the Office of Program Planning, Finance, and Budget, for example. This can be done at the first informal meeting, and generally, if the proposed language doesn't have budget implications, it's easier to adopt. At the first meeting, delegations are invited to send proposals and comments electronically by a certain date to gain time and close the consultations. Generally, and if it's a short resolution, there will be at least 3 or more informal meetings and trying to close all the paragraphs. If new comments are received, a compilation is circulated again, and a deadline is given to receive a new language or comments. Regarding closing paragraphs, from then on, the new proposals are compiled and paragraphs are closed. The paragraphs that don't have comments can be agreed at the ref and leave open the paragraphs with comments. Agreed at referendum means that paragraphs that have been agreed on in principle, but are waiting for a final okay from delegations. Another aspect that you should consider is what happens if you have different views among the delegations on particular issues on your resolutions. There will be paragraphs with opposing proposal or different views among delegations. As the facilitator, you will notice which delegations causes more difficulties on certain points. So it's advisable that to meet separately, I don't know, Vienna coffee, delegates lunch, etc., to discuss and try to reach a middle ground or one that is acceptable to the parties involved in a specific aspect of the resolution. Also, if there is no agreement on certain paragraphs, the facilitator may call on delegations directly involved and to meet in small groups and return to the room with a proposal or an agreement. You could request to negotiate in small groups in specific paragraphs. It is advisable that the points that generate a little more resistance on the part of some delegations are discussed informally outside the informal meetings, and that prior agreements are reached before the next informal meetings. As a facilitator, you seek to have only support from delegations in the room during the informal consultations. And you work outside the room with the delegations that have issues on pending paragraphs. It's very important in trying to get support and to close the negotiation as soon as possible. What else? We have also the facilitator text and the chair's ruling, for example. At the end, when there are a few paragraphs left pending, and if there is still disagreement for approval, the facilitator can propose a text on the facilitator trying to achieve a balance in the proposal. And if it's not accepted by delegations, the facilitator can apply the ruling of maintaining or retaining the agreed language from the last year in a particular paragraph. When there is no agreement in the room with a new language, you could go back to agreed language and trying to move forward with a resolution. At the end of the negotiations, when the text is agreed, it's put under silence procedure for a couple of days. And when the silence procedure expires, it's sent to the secretariat so that the text goes to editing and then to translations. And then to adopt, the adoption is fixed. The Secretariat requests two versions, the one with track changes and the clean version of your resolution. So you have to be very careful and try to follow all of them with the previous versions and the final Rev 1 that you are going to send to the Secretariat. Sometimes the editors rightly suggest your consent to change some words. In some cases, they are right. In others, sometimes it's a sensitive issue that it's better to avoid changes and leave it as it was agreed in the room. So you have to be very careful with in this phase with the editors. At adoption, the facilitator can usually present the text before the adoption in a plenary meeting, thanking delegations for their support and highlighting the achievements or the progress in the resolution. Co-sponsorships of the resolution should be also considered before the adoption. Co-sponsors, lobbying for the greatest number of co-sponsorships begins on the first day of the negotiations. Several delegations will wait for the text to be finalized before co-sponsoring. At each informal meeting, they are reminded that co-sponsorship is open on e-delegates, and note verbal can be sent requesting co-sponsorship to member states. Also, the PR, the permanent representative, can approach some delegations to add support on this matter. Whereas in general terms, this is the procedure and the role of the facilitator. Also, depending on the particularities of the topic and where the resolution is negotiated, the roles change a little bit between committees, but it's more or less the same thing. What happens if the negotiation doesn't result in consensus? The sponsor or the facilitator can either request action on the original document or the negotiated text. In both cases, the draft resolution or the decision is submitted to a vote, often accompanied by a proposal for amendments and requests for paragraphs votes. Next slide, please, Ali. Finally, I would like to share with you a quote from a speech delivered by the current PGA regarding the importance of what we are doing here at the UN, highlighting the role of multilateralism, which includes, of course, negotiating resolutions. It says, through constructive debate and negotiations, ideas develop into norms, which in turn drive policy development and implementations with a view to advancing the course of humanity. Thank you very much for everything.
Thank you so much, Mario, for your presentation. I invite any participants to, with any questions for Mario, to write them in the chat, and I will relay them.
Sure, you can get the slides if you want.
Okay, we will circulate all materials to participants again once at the conclusion of the workshop. And the recording of the session will be available. We will post a summary article of the workshop in a few days along with the recording, and I will circulate that as well to you all once it is published. So if there aren't any questions at this time, if there are any more questions, we will resume this session at 3 p.m. So if you think of any questions you'd like to ask, please hold on to them. Ooh, we do have one question. I believe this is a question for Anne-Laure, if you would like to take it. Let's see. Oh, she answered it in the chat. Okay. Well, At this time, I will say thank you all for joining us for our morning session of Drafting Resolutions Workshop. Thank you to all of our distinguished panelists that have joined us for this session. It's been a wonderful experience, and I hope that all of you have benefited from all of this information. Like I mentioned, we will resume at 3 p.m. With Ms. Tomoko and Mr. Fernando, who will continue. So we hope you will join us then. Thank you. See you soon.